In this video, we are going to be studying Wordsworth's poem Tintern Abbey. Now, the actual title of the poem is Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey on Revisiting the Banks of the Wye During a Tour, July 13th, 1798. But that's a lot to say, and it would take forever to talk about the poem if we had to say that every time. So, for convenience's sake, it has been popularly abbreviated to just Tintern Abbey. However, that can be confusing because Tintern Abbey itself never appears in the poem. He's actually a few miles away from Tintern Abbey. That's the local landmark. But he is on the banks of the Wye River, overlooking the river. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to have time to look at many of Wordsworth's other poems, especially the Immortality Ode, the Loci poems, a series of enigmatic poems contemplating mortality after the death of a young child, supposedly named Lucy, especially Strange Fits of Passion I Have Known and A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal are two very interesting poems from that selection. Also, I'd love to be able to look at The Solitary Reaper and Resolution and Independence, two of the other poems that I think are really useful to understand Wordsworth, and also great poems in themselves. Tintern Abbey is what is known as a conversation poem, and it's called a conversation poem for two reasons. One of the reasons it's called a conversation poem is because it literally is a conversation. It is one half of a conversation, which Wordsworth addresses to his sister, who is addressed in the last first paragraph specifically, although she doesn't actually reply. So in one sense, it actually is a monologue delivered to an unspeaking auditor, and so therefore half of a conversation. And the other reason is because of its very conversational tone. It doesn't follow a set structure. It uses verse paragraphs rather than stanzas. Stanzas are a series of repeating elements of a poem or a song which follow a standardized structure throughout. So each stanza repeats the same structure over and over with different words, obviously. A verse paragraph, on the other hand, is a more organic form. It works the same way as a paragraph does in an essay. You continue the paragraph until you move on to the new topic, and when you switch topics, you start a new paragraph, in this case, a verse paragraph. We'll be watching how each of these different verse paragraphs is unified by a specific theme within the larger theme of the poem. The other thing you need to pay attention to in this poem, and we'll be looking at, is it embodies Wordsworth's concept of two consciousnesses. And the two consciousnesses are the consciousness of the poet at the time he experienced the things described, and the consciousness of the poet at the time he writes the poem. And that is central to this poem because this poem is based upon Wordsworth revisiting a specific location that he had visited 5 years earlier, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, as he says in the poem, and contemplating the difference, not in the scenery, which has stayed the same, but in the poet and how he's changed since he saw it last. And so we're going to start going through this poem, verse by verse, and looking at how Wordsworth studies the difference between his much younger self and he himself now, what he's learned from that change during that time, what he's lost, but ultimately what he has gained that will help him through the rest of his life. Before we start talking about the poem Tintern Abbey, I want to talk a little bit about reading poetry in general. One of the things that you may encounter in this course is that I'll assign you a poem, and then you'll read it. And you may think that you have a good understanding, or you may think, I just don't get this poem. But in some cases, then afterwards, you'll watch the lecture in which we discuss the poem. And in some cases, you'll have already come to all of the same conclusions that I've come to about the poem, which is great. That means you're smarter than I am. Or in other cases, you may completely understand everything that I said about the poem, but you think, it makes perfect sense now, but I didn't see it that way when I read it the first way, so I misread it. And it may become very frustrating to you. And if that's the case, I just need to warn you, or I need to let you know that reading poetry is not something that just comes immediately to anyone. I've been teaching these poems for 30 years now. I've read this particular poem thousands of times. I've also had this poem taught to me by brilliant scholars, and I've been able to listen to them talk about it. And then I've had the opportunity over the years to listen to many brilliant students talk to me about this poem, about what's going on. And as a result of that, I've been able to develop an understanding about the poem. But it wasn't like I just read it the first time and went, oh, okay, I know immediately what's going on with this poem. It took me many, many, many years. And so no one reads a poem the first time and completely understands it. It is a process of going back through the poem over and over again. And each time you go through it, you learn something new about the poem. And that knowledge builds up until you finally have a fairly detailed and comfortable understanding about what's going on. And it is still true that every time I read this poem, I learn things about it I didn't know. One of the examples of that will be the last verse paragraph of this. For many years, I had no idea what was going on with that last first paragraph. And I'd teach the whole poem, and I'd get to the last first paragraph, and I'd turn around and just say, okay, well, this is great. Isn't it beautiful? Let's move on. And then I realized how sort of intellectually dishonest that was. So I took some time to sit down and figure out what was going on with that last first paragraph and how it fit into the poem. And now I feel like I have a reasonably good understanding that we will be talking about later. But it wasn't something that came to me immediately. It's something that took many years to develop. So don't go into a poem and read it expecting to understand it completely and perfectly the first time. It is a process of gradually honing and developing your reading over time by listening to other people talk about it and repeating the readings and seeing new things. What you're looking at here is a page from my personal copy of Wordsworth's poems in which I have collected notes. And this is what I do. I call it graphing a poem. As I read it, I go through and make notes to myself in the margin of what's going on in each section. And each time I go back through, I add more and more notes until it starts to look like this. It's completely covered with notes. And even this reading that you're looking at, this page covered with notes, doesn't even begin to touch what I have written in other books about this poem and many of the things that we'll be talking about. And so I find this very useful for me to remind me about what's going on as I read the poem. I'm a heavy marginal annotator in all of the books, and I use post-it notes endlessly. I have a huge supply, and I post-it note tag things all the time. So I suggest that this is a useful way for you perhaps to encounter a poem and to help make notations that you can go back to later to refer to how you read the poem the first time you encountered it. So let's move on and actually look at the poem Tintern Abbey. And so we are on page 299 in the Norton Anthology, and this is the first verse paragraph of Tintern Abbey. Now, once again, just so it's clear, the name of the poem is Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey on Revisiting the Banks of the Wye During a Tour July 13th, 1798. We call it Tintern Abbey for short, so it does get abbreviated to Tintern Abbey. However, bear in mind that this is a few miles above Tintern Abbey. It's not actually at Tintern Abbey, and the abbey itself never appears in the poem. He is in a rural natural scene overlooking the Wye River Valley. Now, the Wye River runs through and has carved canyons at this portion of England near Tintern Abbey. And he is standing up on one of the cliffs over the valley below, looking down on the valley. He has an aerial view down into the valley that is cut off from the world around it by cliffs. And the canyon down below, there are buildings and structures down there, and then the river sort of winds in between them. But they're kind of land of the lost, cut off from the world around it by these steep cliff walls. And so he's not actually standing on the banks of the river, dipping his toes into the water, but rather standing up on the top of one of the cliffs, looking down into the Wye River Valley and looking down at the cottages and the farmlands beneath. And so what he's seeing is this sort of aerial view of the Wye Canyon. All right, so he starts off. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day has come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again, I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows. Little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms, green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees with some uncertain notice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. So I mentioned before, when you're reading a poem, one of the first things you want to look for is you want to look for repetition, because repetition guides you to what the poet thinks is important. If he keeps saying it over and over again, it must be important. And so what do we see repeated here? Well, one of the things we see repeated here is again. Again I hear these waters. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs. The day has come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows. So the word again pops up 4 times in 22 lines. That's a lot of times, considering all the words he could have used. So one of the things that is repeated is again. The second thing you want to pay attention to is the fact that he's using, you'll notice, instead of using indefinite articles, he's using definite articles. Instead of a, he's using the. So these waters, he's referring to these waters, these steep and lofty cliffs, this dark sycamore, and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, these hedgerows, these pastoral farms. We have this and these repeated over and over again. So what's the significance of this? Why is he repeating these things? Well, the first thing that seems pretty clear is when he starts off, he says, 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, and again I hear these waters. So it's clear that he has been away from this scene for 5 years, and he's coming back to it. He's coming back to this scene. So 5 years, 5 summers, the length of 5 long winters. And remember, once again, England is far north, and in the summer it stays bright a long time, but in the winter it gets dark early and stays dark for a long time and gets cold and damp. So winters can be long. So it's been 5 long years. 5 long years he's been away. And now he's back to this scene. By the way, at this point, it's worth pointing out a common misconception and why you should be very careful about looking at online sources when you study poetry, because many of these sources are written by morons who don't seem to be able to read. In some of the online sources, it says that Wordsworth is revisiting a scene from his childhood memory, but in the poem itself, he tells us that it's been 5 years since he was here last, and it gives us a specific date. Now, Wordsworth was born in 1770, and this is dated in 1798. So at the time of the visit recorded in this poem, he is 28 years old. 5 years earlier, he would have been 23 years old. So he was not a child, but simply a younger adult at the time of his previous visit that he's remembering. And these are not childhood memories that he is revisiting, but memories of his previous visit. He tells us later in the poem, on line 73, that at his previous visit, when nature was all in all to him, that the coarser pleasures of his boyish days and their glad animal movements had all gone by. So he was not a child, but an adult in his previous visit, and simply is an older adult during this current visit. The moral of the story is to question everything that you read and test it against the data that the text itself provides. And further, that online cheat sites like shmoop.com, SparkNotes, and even Wikipedia are often written by idiots. So why does he insist on again and this and these? Have you ever been away from a scene for a long time, or been away from a place for a long time and returned to it? Especially a place that you last visited when you were a child and come back to it. Maybe you've moved away somewhere and you go back to visit as an adult, someplace where you had grown up. A few years ago, I won't go into the full story, but a few years ago I had the opportunity to visit the home that I grew up in, on the way back to a family reunion. It's in Lubbock, Texas, and we were traveling through, and I decided I wanted to show my wife the house I'd grown up in. And so we drove by, we're driving down the street, and a young couple were out in front, and they noticed us driving by, so we stopped, and they asked us what was going on. I explained that my father had built that house and I'd grown up in it. He built it when I was 7, and we moved away when I was 11. And that doesn't seem like a very long time, but when you're a little kid, that's an eon. And I watched him build it, and then we lived in it. We were able to go back into that house, my wife and I. And one of the first things I noticed, I remembered this house as being tremendous, as being huge. It had a big entryway, a big living room immediately off the entry, and then a huge cavernous den with a huge fireplace. I remembered this huge house, and when my wife and I walked in, it wasn't that big. How could I have been so wrong about remembering what my childhood house looked like? I imagined this huge mansion-like place, and it was just a fairly normal-sized, small family home. And then it dawned on me. The last time I saw this house, I was 11, and I was 3 feet shorter than I was when I went back to see it as an adult. So it seemed so much larger because I was so much smaller. And what that means, why that's significant here, is that when you come back to a place, it may not be that the place has changed. It may be that when you see it, the place is the same, but what it does is it shows you how much you've changed since that time. And I think that that's what Wordsworth is seeing here. He's again back at this place, and he's seeing the place, this dark sycamore, these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts. He's seeing them again, but they look different. And it's not that they've changed, it's that he has. And so this poem is going to be about how he has changed since he was here 5 years ago. And he'll be talking explicitly about this later in the poem. The second thing I want you to notice about this is I want you to notice what's happening here. So he's listening to the waters of the River Wye rolling from the mountain springs down to the sea at the soft inland murmur, because the Wye is inland at this point. He's nowhere near the sea. Standing on these cliffs and looking down on this wild, secluded scene. So he's looking down on the scene that seems cut off from the world around it by the steep and lofty cliffs. And the steep and lofty cliffs, the cliffs themselves, impress upon this wild, secluded scene thoughts of a more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. So this area suggests seclusion within nature, that it's cut off from the world around it. It's like land of the lost. And so he is now reposing here under this dark sycamore and looking down at this scene. So when he looks down on the scene, what does he see? He looks down and he sees these plots of cottage ground. Okay, cottage ground would be the cottage and then the gardens around it. So it would include, the yard and the trees and the cottage and the gardens around it. And this particular set of cottage ground that he's looking at, these different places that he's looking at, have orchards. So what's the condition of the orchards? These orchard tufts. Remember, they're orchard tufts because he's looking down on it. All he sees is the trees from above. So they're tufts of trees. And he's looking down at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue. So they're fruit trees, but because the fruit is green, the trees are all green. And because they're all green, they lose themselves mid groves and copses. So they lose themselves. The question is, what is an orchard? Well, an orchard is a group of trees that have been planted by a farmer in order to grow fruits. What's a grove and a copse? Well, in this particular case, a grove and a copse refers to bunches of trees that occur naturally. They're bunches of trees that have grown in a particular location. A copse of trees is a tree grove naturally occurring. What's happened here is that the trees planted by the farmer in order to grow fruits have become, because they're all green, they get lost within nature. So what we have is human creations, or human society. It's lost in or returning to nature. And that's the theme of the next couple of images. The trees losing themselves in the groves because they're returning to nature. Once again, I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild. Well, a hedgerow in England and in parts of the United States too, like Washington and Oregon, they have these berry bushes that grow. And if you're from Oregon, you know that the Oregonians like to make fun of Californians because you drive along and right alongside the highway, there'll be this berry bush, and they have these berries on them which taste really good. They're just wild growing berries that you can pick and eat, and they're delicious. But the the bushes have these razor-sharp, long thorns on them, and if you stick your hand into the bush in order to pick a berry, you pull it back, your hand's going to be bloody. Well, they have similar kinds of things growing in England, similar kinds of plants growing in England, and they grow them, they culture them into hedgerows, which are tall bushes that are trimmed in order to form naturally occurring fences. And they're really good because they're naturally occurring, they're naturally renewing. They let the bunnies and the mice and stuff go through and the wildlife go through, but they keep the livestock in and they keep people out. And so a hedgerow is a naturally occurring bush that's been grown into a fence. But these hedgerows are hardly hedgerows. Little lines of sported wood run wild. The hedgerows are growing wild. They're returning to their natural state. So once again, we have copses returning to their natural state. Now we have the hedgerows returning to their natural state. And then we have these pastoral farms, green to the very door. So the greenery is growing right up to the door of the farms as though it's going to take them over, and the farms themselves are going to become taken over by nature. So even the farms are returning to nature. And wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees with some uncertain notice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods. So you're looking out into the forest, you're looking across the tops of the trees. Across the forest, you see wreaths of smoke coming up from the trees. You can't see the houses. So it looks like there are vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, like it's Robin Hood and his merry men living in the forest, or Ewoks or something who live in the forest in the houseless woods. So it's people who have returned to nature. They've moved into the forest and living it as their home. So again, we have this idea that humans are returning to nature. And then finally we have some hermit's cave, where by fire the hermit sits alone. And this is the thoughts of a more deep seclusion. A hermit is someone who has left human society and gone off to live by himself, in this case in a cave, not in a house, but he's retreated to a cave, living alone in nature. So all of these are images of human returning to nature. How is this relevant? Well, where has Wordsworth been for the last 5 years? As he'll tell us, he's been in the city. He's been cut off from nature. And now he's coming back. And he hopes, like all of these other objects that have become reinvested with nature, or become reintegrated into nature, he hopes, like these other objects, he will be able to reintegrate into nature. If the first verse paragraph describes the narrative situation, Wordsworth has returned to this beautiful natural scene near the Wye River after a 5-year absence in the city. It also implies Wordsworth's concerns. Can he, after this absence in the city, return to this natural scene and become reintegrated with nature? The second verse paragraph then describes what's at stake, why it's so important that Wordsworth be able to establish this reintegration with nature. These beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities I have owed to them in hours of weariness sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration. Feelings too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as have no slight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Nor less I trust to them I may have owed another gift of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened, that serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on until the breath of this corporeal frame, and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. This describes the significance of this scene and of nature during Wordsworth's absence in the city. He is going to describe 3 distinct benefits that he has gained from his experience in nature while in the city. He begins, these beauteous forms, obviously he's referring to the beauteous forms of the scene around the Wye River a few miles from Tintern Abbey, through a long absence in the city, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities. I have owed to them in hours of weariness sensation sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration. So, benefit number one that he derives from this is this tranquil restoration. As he has been in the city, amid the din of towns, he has been able to remember this beautiful scene, and it has provided him with this tranquil restoration. So that's the first benefit. The second benefit is the next section. Feelings too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as have no slight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Okay, so have no slight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life. So the unremembered pleasure, we'll be talking about that particular term a little bit later, is one of the things that makes him a good man. The fact that he has had this connection with nature has provided him with the motivation to be a moral person, to be a good man. The little nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. So the second benefit is it's made him a good person. It provides him with a moral center. Unremembered pleasure. What would unremembered pleasure be? Well, the term unremembered itself is a trope known as litotes. Litotes is denying the negative rather than stating the positive. So rather than stating something, you deny its opposite. It's actually a form of irony. Irony is a trope in which one statement can have multiple meanings simultaneously in its most basic sense. So unremembered pleasure, well, it would not be forgotten pleasure. Forgotten pleasure is gone. But it's something that you don't remember specifically, but you still have the general sense of it. I think of, like childhood influences. You may not remember every detail about your childhood, but you certainly have a general sense of the tone. And so, even though he doesn't remember every single event from his past or from his relationship with nature, he still remembers the tone. It's not forgotten, but it's not fully remembered. And that unremembered pleasure is an influence on his future life. And so he, as a result of having his own unremembered pleasure, is sort of paying it forward. So it becomes the best portion of a good man's life, his little nameless unremembered acts of kindness and of love. And this is not the Gates Foundation giving $1 billion to education. That's not a little nameless unremembered act. But the little good things one does, opening the door for someone, smiling at a stranger, backing off to let someone you don't know onto the freeway at rush hour. All of those little things that make the life better for people in general. It provides a positive texture for society, a generally positive atmosphere. His happy, restorative memory of his relationship with nature has made him a kinder and gentler person, a better person. This is benefit number 2. This was benefit number 1. Now we go to benefit number 3. Nor less I trust to them I may have owed another gift. This is the introduction of benefit number 3. Of aspect more sublime. And remember, we talked about the difference between the sublime and the beautiful when we talked about I wandered lonely as a cloud. The sublime is something, it's not beautiful, it's something above that. It's some much more powerful experience. That blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. So, caught in the city, one is caught up in the alienation and disconnection and loss of clarity that comes along with civilized city life. All of this unintelligible world. It doesn't seem to make any sense. And that failure to make sense provides a heavy and a weary weight. That serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on, until the breath of this corporeal frame. So what's a corporeal frame? Well, it's your corpus, your body. What he means is your actual breathing. And even the motion of our human blood almost suspended. So we enter a state of suspended animation. we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul. So this is an interesting and important term in Romanticism. We'll see this again in Keats. He actually uses the word. It's ecstasy. Now, ecstasy is not, in this particular case, a rave drug. Ecstasy is literally, it comes from the Greek root ekstasis. It's literally an out-of-body experience. It's when your body enters a state of suspended animation and your soul rises out of your body. And we use it to describe the state of extreme bliss where it seems to be extracorporeal bliss. So in this particular case, he's literally describing ecstasy, the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended. We are laid asleep in body and become a living soul. While with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. This is a big moment in this poem. His memories of nature, while he's in the city, not only give him tranquil restoration and make him a nicer guy, but they also help him make sense of the universe. It helps him to pierce through the burden of the mystery of all this unintelligible world and see into the life of things, make sense of existence. So this is the third benefit that Wordsworth derives from his memories of nature. An essential insight into the life of things, an essential understanding of what matters and what's really going on underneath all of this unintelligible world that has been created by the din of towns and cities. But the next first paragraph starts off with an expression of doubt. If this be but a vain belief. So where does this doubt come from after this moment of essential insight into the life of things? And in order to see how doubt is embedded into this poem and the tension between certainty and doubt that's going on throughout this poem, we need to go back to the previous verse paragraph. Remember in the previous verse paragraph, we mentioned the trope of litotes. And we talked about the fact that litotes is a form of irony which implies multiple meanings simultaneously. And it does it by denying the negative rather than stating the positive. So that while you're stating one thing, you're also similarly reminding us that the negative version of that exists. For instance, what might be called a left-handed insult. When you say to someone, "Wow, you don't look awful today." That's not really a compliment. I mean, on one hand, the literal sense is you look good today, but by saying you don't look awful, you're implying that the possibility of looking awful is there and that one normally looks awful. So that would be how litotes is able to maintain both simultaneously. Well, in this particular case, you'll notice that we have litotes several times. The first one comes up when he says, "Have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye." What is a landscape to someone who cannot see? A landscape to someone who cannot see is meaningless. Someone who cannot see can't see a landscape. So, has not been meaningless means it's been meaningful, but also implies the possibility that it could be meaningless. And that's a threat that we'll see surfacing later in the poem. It could have become a landscape to a blind man's eye. He also, of course, uses the litotes of unremembered pleasure. We mentioned that before. It's not forgotten, but it's not quite remembered, which leaves the possibility that it could be forgotten at some point, as could the unremembered acts of kindness and love. Once again, unremembered is litotes. And then there are other expressions of doubt as well. In this line he says, "Nor less I trust, to them I may have owed another gift." When does one say I trust? One doesn't say I trust when they're certain. When someone is certain, one just says it. The sun comes up in it every morning. You don't say, I trust the sun will come up tomorrow. That implies that you doubt that it might. So nor less I trust implies doubt. And then he says, may have owed another gift, which also implies doubt. So embedded within this statement about the benefits that the poet gains from his relationship with nature is also an implicit expression of doubt of what he could lose were he to lose this connection, which is where he comes up with, if this be but a vain belief. But you'll notice what he does in this stanza, in this verse paragraph. He says, if this be but a vain belief, and then immediately cuts that thought off and says, yet oh, how oft in darkness and amid the many shapes of joyless daylight, when the fretful stir unprofitable and the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart, how oft in spirit have I turned to thee, O sylvan Wye, thou wanderer through the woods. How often has my spirit turned to thee? So he starts off with a doubt, but then immediately shouts it down by remembering all of the times that this natural scene has been a benefit to him. But he's not going to be able completely to get away from this doubt. And we'll see how it's embedded here later. Just want you to remember this term, unprofitable. Profit comes from the world of the unintelligible world of the towns and cities. It's a world of finance, profit. And part of the problem is Wordsworth is implicitly concerned that he has been too contaminated by the unintelligible world of towns and cities to ever fully regain his connection with nature. And we'll see that in the next verse paragraph. He's remembering in this verse paragraph how often in the past he has turned back to nature. How often in spirit have I turned to thee, O sylvan Wye, in order to regain his tranquil restoration, his sense of moral goodness, and his insight into the life of things. This has happened to him in the past. And then he returns, and this is the two consciousnesses. Remember we mentioned the two consciousnesses. And now he turns to the present with gleams of half-extinguished thought, with many recognitions dim and faint, and somewhat of a sad perplexity. The picture of the mind revives again. And so his memory of his past relationship with nature is coming back to him. But it's not coming back to him perfectly. It's half extinguished. It's dim and faint. It's troubled by sad perplexity. And so he's already starting to sort of forget his previous state in relationship to nature. But here he is again hoping to recharge his moral batteries, recharge his nature batteries for another stint in the city. While here I stand, not only with a sense of present pleasure, but with pleasing thoughts that in this moment there is life and food for future years. And so he is at this point looking out on this scene and recharging his nature batteries. So when he goes back to the city, he will be able to look back on this moment and once again feel the tranquil restoration, the sense of moral goodness, and the insight into the life of things. However, in the middle of this hope about the future, and so I dare to hope, and then he pauses, and this is a pause, and turns back to his memory of what he was before. Though changed, no doubt, from what I was when first I came among these hills, when like a roe I bounded o'er the mountains, by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams, wherever nature led, more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved. For nature then, the coarser pleasures of my boyish days and their glad animal movements all gone by, to me was all in all. I cannot paint what then I was. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, and the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling and a love, yet had no need of a remoter charm by thought supplied, nor any interest unborrowed from the eye. That time is past, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures. And this is a moment of sadness, a moment of loss, that he's been building up to throughout the previous verse paragraphs as he talks about the possibility of forgetting, or he hints at the possibility of forgetting. And where does this possibility of forgetting come from? Well, it comes from his recognition that he has changed when he was here before, because before he says he was like a roe bounding over the mountains. Now, this tells us that a roe is a deer. Roe also means fish eggs, but in this particular case, I don't think that particular image works. This particular roe is a deer, and a roe would be a young male deer who bounded o'er the mountains by the sides of the deep rivers and lonely streams, wherever nature led. How does a deer relate to nature? Well, a deer doesn't go, I feel like I need to go experience some nature today. I'm going to go look at the forest. Because in nature, it lives in the forest. He's part of it. Nature is a part of him, and he's a part of it. He's integrated fully into nature. And in Wordsworth's previous experience, he was like a deer, integrated fully into nature. More like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved. He's not there looking for nature. He's part of it. For nature, then, the coarser pleasures of my boyish days and their glad animal movements all gone by. In other words, he has grown up enough so that he's not just stomping around in mud puddles for the sheer fun of it. He's intelligent and adult enough in order to appreciate the scenery around him. Nature then, to me, was all in all. And he says, I cannot paint what then I was, but he's going to try anyway. He's going to try to put into words what is basically an extra linguistic, because it's an extra social feeling. He's part of nature, not human society. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. A cataract, by the way, is a waterfall, if you didn't already know that. And it haunted him like a passion. So where do passions exist? Well, passions exist inside of you. The waterfall was like a part of me. It was like something that existed inside of me. The tall rock, the mountain, the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling, and a love. They were all integrated into him. They're a part of him. He's a part of nature. That had no need of a remoter charm by thought supplied, nor any interest unborrowed from the eye. This is a really important passage. Remoter charm means more remote charm, right? So, and this is a poetic inversion. It's known as anastrophe. It's when it has no need of a remoter charm supplied by thought. In other words, I didn't need to think about them to gain the charm from them. It was part of me, and I felt it immediately, without any mediation, instantly, nor any interest unborrowed from the eye. And I didn't need to contribute to the feeling anything that didn't come directly from the act of perceiving them. But you'll notice here that he borrows the metaphor from the world of society. Interest unborrowed from the eye. So what is interest? Well, interest has two meanings. The first one, of course, is fascination. Seeing, being interested in something. But it also means it comes from the world of economics and finance. It's the amount of money that you pay for a loan. So it's part of that fretful, stir unprofitable above that hinted at this world of economics and finance. And so he's sort of been contaminated by it. Even his very metaphors describing his relationship to nature come from the world of economics and finance, which suggests that he's been contaminated enough that he can never go back to that previous state, that he's lost his ability to integrate himself with nature completely. Interest unborrowed from the eye is a metaphor from the world that he's trying to escape, and it's embedded himself into his very mind and into his relationship with nature. And that touches off this very elegiac, sad moment. That time is past, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures. So this sadness, this elegiac moment for his lost relationship with nature. However, and I think this is an essential thing to recognize, that there's this tension between what he's lost in his relationship with nature, but what he gains as a result of that. Because he goes on to say, not for this faint eye, nor mourn nor murmur. Other gifts have followed. For such loss I would believe abundant recompense. So he is being paid back in another way. Even though he's lost his initial sense of integration and fitting into nature, he has gained abundant recompense. He's been paid back. But once again, notice that this is the language of finance and economics. Recompense is a financial term. So what does he gain back? And this is, one could argue, the most important portion of this poem, what comes from here to the end of the verse paragraph. Here's his recompense. I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still, sad music of humanity, nor harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man. a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Therefore am I still a lover of the meadows and the woods and the mountains, and of all that we behold from this green earth, of all the mighty world of eye and ear, both what they half create and what perceive, well pleased to recognize in nature and the language of the sense, the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart, and soul of all my moral being. So what has he gained as recompense for his loss of his essential immediate connection with nature? So he's learned to look on nature, no longer a part of it. He now looks on it, but in looking on it, he's able to hear the still sad music of humanity. So he's able to look through nature to humanity. And this takes us back to what we were talking about when I was introducing Wordsworth, that we have the human looking through nature at other humans. So it reestablishes his bond with other people. And he's felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, a motion in the spirit that rolls through all things, that impels all thinking things, all objects of thought, and rolls through all things. I can't hear these lines anymore without thinking of use the Force, Luke.
The Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together.
And it's actually not as silly as it sounds. It's not an inappropriate metaphor. We don't have to go to the full-on mythology of midichlorians and how they embed it in the blood and in nature and they create this field. But he's sort of talking about this thing. This is what he refers to as the great and permanent forms in the preface that are embedded in nature and in the mind of man. This is the motion in a spirit that impels all thinking things, all object of all thought, and rolls through all things. So, therefore, although in a different sense, he's still a lover of the meadows and the woods, and of all that we behold from this great earth, of all the mighty world of eye and ear, both what they half create and what perceive. And this is M.H. Abrams' lamp. Half create, right? It's the poet's way of seeing that allows him to see the world. And then this is the most important part of this. Well pleased to recognize in nature and the language of the sense, that would be nature and his sensual relationship with nature. Through those he gains the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart, and soul of all my moral being. So his new relationship with nature, of seeing through nature to other humans, becomes the source of his moral being. In other words, nature connects him with other people and makes him a better and more moral person. Now, the last first paragraph of this poem, as I mentioned before, for years I had no idea what to do with this, and so would go through this big moment, and then I'd skip the last first paragraph. But actually now I've come to see that it's really quite clear that what he's going to do is that now that he's talked about the theoretical application of nature and it connecting him with other people, he's now going to show us a practical demonstration. Because immediately after showing his connection with nature, his new connection with nature through the language of the sense that gives him his moral being, he now turns to another human, his sister, who's sitting next to him, and shows how this connection will abide in his connection with other human beings. And his sister is the practical demonstration of how this will work. So he says, nor perchance, if I were not thus taught, should I the more suffer my genial spirits to decay. For thou art with me here upon the banks of this fair river, thou my dearest friend, my dear, dear friend. And in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart, and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. Oh, yet a little while may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister. And this prayer I make, knowing that nature never did betray the heart that loved her. 'Tis her privilege through all the years of this our life to lead from joy to joy. For she can so inform the mind that is within us, so impress with quietness and beauty, and so feed with lofty thoughts, that neither evil tongues, rash judgments, nor the sneers of selfish men, nor greetings where no kindness is, nor all the dreary intercourse of daily life shall e'er prevail against us, or disturb our cheerful faith that all which we behold is full of blessings. Therefore, let the moon shine on thee in thy solitary walk. and let the misty mountain winds be free to blow against thee. And in after years, when these wild ecstasies shall be matured into a sober pleasure, when thy mind shall be as a mansion for all lovely forms, thy memory be as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. O then, if solitude or fear or pain or grief should be thy portion, with what healing thoughts of tender joy wilt thou remember me in these my exhortations. Nor perchance, if I should be where I can no more hear thy voice, nor catch from thy wild eyes these gleams of past existence, wilt thou then forget that on the banks of this delightful stream we stood together, and that I, so long a worshipper of nature, hither came unwearied in that service, or rather say with warmer love, with far deeper zeal of holier love. Nor wilt thou then forget that after many wanderings and many years of absence, these steep woods and lofty cliffs, and this green pastoral landscape were to me more dear both for themselves and for thy sake. And so he turns to his sister to show how they are connected through their mutual bond with nature. And he says that even if I weren't taught by my relationship with nature, I would see it in you. He says, should I the more suffer my genial spirits to decay? And so the gloss down there says creative powers. But genial spirits here is actually a really powerful term for the Romantics. It comes from the Latin term genius loci. Genius loci is, literally, this is the spirit of the place. Genius is spirit. Loci is of the place. The notion that in Latin times, trees had spirits, and the idea was that basically because they were usually people who had gotten turned into trees by angry gods. But you imbued, as Blake talked about, the people imbued spirits to things and places. And so a genius loci would be the spirit of the place. And for the nature poets, of course, seeing nature as a living being, they loved this idea. And so genial spirits here suggest not only my congenial spirits, those things that bind me to other people. Genial means friendly. He was genial means he was friendly. But it also, his spiritual bond with nature is being implied by this. So even if he wasn't taught by his language of the sense and his bond with nature, he would be taught by his connection with his sister. For thou art with me here upon the banks of this fair river. And in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. Okay, Dorothy's younger than he is. So he is now grown old and a bit jaded, but he's able to look at his younger sister, who is now in this beautiful scene and experiencing what he used to feel 5 years ago when he was here. And he's looking at her and experiencing it vicariously. He's going, that's it. That's what I felt. I remember from you. So their mutual bond to nature is creating this bond between them. Oh, yet a little while may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister. And since he's able to share this natural bond with his sister, with Dorothy, he offers her a natural blessing. This prayer I make, knowing that nature never did betray the heart that loved her, because she can impress us with quietness and beauty, that she protects us from all the crap that goes on in the real world. The lofty thoughts with which she imbues us protect us from evil tongues, rash judgments, the snares of selfish men, greetings where no kindness is, nor all the dreary intercourse of daily life. One remembers Hamlet from his explanation of all of the things that destroy him in the to be or not to be soliloquy. All of those things can never prevail against us or disturb our cheerful faith. And so here he begins his blessing. This is his natural benediction. Therefore let the moon shine on thee in thy solitary walk, and let the misty mountain winds be free to blow against thee. And later, when you get to be like me and these wild ecstasies mature into a sober pleasure, then, like me, your mind is a mansion for all lovely forms, thy memory is a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. Oh, then, if you're suffering from sad things, you will be able to remember this scene and my exhortations about this scene, and they'll bring you back that tranquil restoration. And even if I can't see you, then I will remember your eyes and your bond with nature, and that will bring me back, and that will bring us together. This connection with nature that he shares with his sister and shares with other humans, therefore becomes the deeper zeal of a holier love. The natural scenes are more dear not only in themselves, but because they've created this human bond. In this poem, Wordsworth is experiencing both the loss of his intimate and immediate connection with nature, but feels he's being paid back because in losing his connection with nature, which was to some extent isolating because he was connected with nature, not with other humans, he has gained the power of being more connected with other people, and therefore that makes him a more moral being. And therefore it's in many ways, even though he's lost the deep passion and the power of his initial connection, he's better off now because he's a better person.